July 1942, Papua New Guinea. Japanese officers broke into an Australian supply depot, opened the ration crates, and literally laughed at what they found inside. Tinned peaches, chocolate bars, butter, and jam seemed like a joke compared to their own rice-based rations. Within 3 months, those same Japanese forces would be eating grass and tree bark while their enemies stayed fighting fit, and starving soldiers would be surrendering just to get their hands on those rations they once mocked. So what did the Australians understand about jungle warfare that turned food into their most devastating weapon, one that would kill more enemy soldiers than bullets ever could? The Kokoda tracks stretched like a muddy scar across the Owen Stanley Range, and Japanese officers were laughing. They had just captured an Australian supply depot, and inside the wooden crates, they found something they couldn't believe: tinned peaches, chocolate bars, butter, jam, tea and sugar, even cigarettes. One officer held up a can of condensed milk and shook his head, grinning at his fellow soldiers. To them, this was proof that their enemy was soft, weak, dependent on luxuries that had no place in war. They had been taught that real soldiers needed only rice and discipline. These Australians, they thought, were like children who couldn't fight without their treats. But the laughter covered up a darker truth that the Japanese command refused to speak about. At that very moment, over 13,000 Japanese troops were trying to cross those same mountains to reach Port Moresby. They were starving. The official ration was 800 grams of rice per day for each soldier, but that was just a number on paper. In reality, most men received only 200 to 300 grams. Some went days without any food at all. The jungle around them offered almost nothing to eat. The water was full of disease. The terrain was so steep that soldiers had to crawl on their hands and knees, burning thousands of calories just to move forward. And they were dying, not from bullets or bombs, but from hunger. The numbers told a story that Japanese officers didn't want to admit. Of those 13,000 men who began the march, only 2,600 would reach their destination. The rest would collapse along the trail, too weak to continue. Some would die of starvation. Others would get diseases that their starving bodies couldn't fight off. By the end of the Pacific War, a horrifying statistic would emerge. Over 80% of Japanese soldiers who died in the Pacific Theater didn't die in combat. They died from starvation and disease. But in July 1942, the official belief was that all armies suffered equally in the jungle. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was sick. That was just how war worked in this green hell. The Japanese weren't wrong about one thing. The jungle was indeed hell. The heat pressed down like a wet blanket. Humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick they turned the air gray. Leeches dropped from trees and crawled up through boot leather. The rain came down so hard it felt like being beaten. Soldiers would wake up to find their skin covered in tropical ulcers. Malaria burned through entire units. Dysentery left men too weak to walk. And underneath it all was the constant, gnawing hunger that made everything worse. What the Japanese officers didn't know as they smirked at those Australian ration crates was that someone on the other side had done the math. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Layden and the men of the Australian Army Service Corps weren't frontline fighters. Many of them had been rejected from combat roles. Some were too old, some had injuries, some just weren't the type that propaganda posters showed charging into battle. They were the support staff, the ones who handled supplies and logistics, the kind of soldiers that other soldiers sometimes looked down on. But Layden understood something that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. He understood that the old saying wasn't just words. An army really does march on its stomach. It wasn't poetry, it was science. Leiden had calculated exactly how many calories a soldier needed to fight in jungle combat. The answer was between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day. That was how much energy a human body burned when it was carrying 60 pounds of equipment up mountain trails in 100-degree heat, while also trying to stay alert enough not to get killed. But most armies were feeding their soldiers only 2,500 to 3,000 calories. The Japanese were often providing barely 2,000. The human body can't run on empty any more than a truck can drive without fuel. British military advisors had visited Australian camps and told them they were being wasteful. The rations were too expensive, they said, too elaborate. Soldiers didn't need all that. It would make them soft. It would create unrealistic expectations. The Australians were spending 2 shillings and 4 pence per soldier per day on rations. That seemed like too much. Traditional hardtack biscuits and tinned beef had been good enough for armies for 100 years. Why change now? Japanese intelligence reports said similar things. They described Western armies as dependent on luxuries, unable to endure real hardship. The Japanese soldier was superior, they claimed, because he could survive on less. He was tougher, more disciplined. He didn't need butter and jam and chocolate to fight. Those things were signs of weakness, not strength. But Leiden had seen what happened to soldiers who didn't get enough food. He had watched men lose weight so fast you could see their faces change from week to week. He had seen tropical diseases tear through units where the men were already weakened by hunger. He had seen soldiers who were too tired to think clearly, too exhausted to react quickly in combat. And he had realized something that would prove more important than any rifle or artillery piece. Keeping soldiers properly fed wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon, maybe the most important weapon of all, because a starving army couldn't fight no matter how brave its soldiers were or how good their training had been. The jungle would kill them before the enemy ever got the chance. The Australian jungle ration didn't look like much from the outside. It came in a compact package that weighed only 1.8 kilograms for a full day's worth of food. That was lighter than the British equivalent, which weighed 2.5 kilograms and gave soldiers fewer calories. Inside that small package was something revolutionary: 4,200 calories, carefully divided into 28 different components. Each item had been chosen not just for energy, but for balance. There were dehydrated vegetables that kept 90% of their nutrients even after processing. There were high-energy chocolate blocks that packed 600 calories into just 100 grams. There were instant soup powders that only needed boiling water. There was tinned butter and jam, things the Japanese army had never even considered issuing to troops. There was tea, sugar, and condensed milk as standard items, not luxuries. There were even cigarettes because someone had understood that morale mattered when you were trying to survive in hell. Every detail had been thought through with precision. The tins were designed to open easily even with cold, wet hands. The packaging could survive being dropped from aircraft or carried through rivers. The food wouldn't spoil in extreme heat and humidity. Nothing in the ration required complicated preparation. A soldier could eat it cold if he had to, or heat it quickly over a small fire. The whole system was built around one simple idea. In the jungle, every ounce of weight mattered, every minute of preparation time mattered, and every calorie mattered most of all. In March 1942, before any of these rations went to the front lines, They were tested in the Queensland rainforests. 2 groups of soldiers went into the jungle for 3 weeks of hard training. Group A received the new jungle rations. Group B received standard military rations. Both groups did the same exercises, marched the same distances, and faced the same conditions. After 3 weeks, the difference was stark. 94% of the soldiers in Group A were still combat ready. They had maintained their strength and health. But in Group B, only 67% were still fit to fight. 15% had to be hospitalized with malnutrition, disease, or exhaustion. The numbers didn't lie, but numbers on paper don't always convince people who hold the purse strings. Australian Command looked at the cost and hesitated. 2 shillings and 4 pence per soldier per day seemed expensive. Multiply that by thousands of soldiers and the price tag grew fast. British liaison officers were even more skeptical. They warned that these elaborate rations would create unrealistic expectations. Soldiers would become dependent on comfort. What would happen when supply lines broke down? Wouldn't it be better to train men to endure hardship rather than shield them from it? And there was another concern that nobody wanted to say out loud, but everyone was thinking. Shipping these rations to New Guinea would require 300 tons per week for every division. That was space on ships that could carry ammunition, weapons, or other supplies. Then General Thomas Blamey made a decision that would save thousands of lives. Blamey was the commander of Australian forces, and he had personally gone on a reconnaissance mission to the Kokoda track. He had climbed those muddy mountains. He had felt the exhaustion that came from fighting the terrain itself. And he had tested the jungle rations himself. After that experience, he made his position clear. He said he wouldn't send men to fight on empty bellies. If the choice was between spending money on rations or spending lives on casualties, he would spend the money. His direct order cut through all the debate and hesitation. The jungle rations would go to the troops. Getting those rations to the front lines became its own kind of warfare. The Kokoda track had no roads. Vehicles couldn't reach most of the fighting positions. Everything had to be carried by hand or dropped from the sky. DC-3 aircraft flew low over the jungle canopy, pushing crates out of open doors. Some of the packages hit trees and burst open. Some landed in enemy territory, but enough got through. On the ground, native carriers became heroes of the supply chain. These local men knew the trails better than anyone. They could move through terrain that left Australian soldiers gasping for breath. The Australians paid them well, 10 pounds of rations per porter per week, which was a fortune in that place and time. The carriers would load 60-pound packs onto their backs and disappear into the green maze, then return days later for another load. The supply officers also created forward dumps, hidden caches of supplies scattered along the route. Every 20 miles, they tried to establish a 50-ton stockpile. These dumps were buried under leaves and branches to hide them from Japanese patrols. They became lifelines for Australian troops pushing forward or falling back. A soldier might be down to his last day of rations, exhausted and wondering if he could keep going. Then stumble onto one of these hidden treasures. In August 1942, the 7th Division received full jungle rations as they fought their way along the Kokoda track. The results showed up fast. Within 2 weeks, the disease rate in the division dropped from 40% to 18%. That meant more men able to fight instead of lying in field hospitals. Combat effectiveness reports told the same story. These soldiers were maintaining their strength even during the grueling mountain warfare. They could march all day, dig foxholes at night, and wake up ready to do it again. Their officers reported something that sounded almost impossible given the conditions. Morale was holding steady. Men who had enough food in their bellies could endure the heat, the rain, the bugs, and the fear. Men who were starving broke down mentally as well as physically. The proof wasn't just in reports and statistics. It was visible in the soldiers themselves. Australian troops after 3 months in the jungle looked tired and dirty, but they still had meat on their bones. They could still move with energy. Their eyes were still alert. They looked like men who were fighting a war, not like men who were slowly dying. And that difference, measured in calories and careful planning, was about to become the difference between victory and defeat. The contrast between the two armies became impossible to ignore. Australian soldiers were losing an average of 4 to 7 kilograms during a 3-month deployment in the jungle. That was significant weight loss, but it was manageable. Their bodies stayed strong enough to fight. Japanese soldiers were losing 18 to 25 kilograms in the same time period. That wasn't just weight loss. That was starvation eating away at muscle and bone until there was almost nothing left. The casualty rates told an even more brutal story. 12% of Australian casualties came from disease and starvation. For the Japanese, that number was 70%. 7 out of every 10 Japanese soldiers who died in the Pacific didn't die because an enemy shot them. They died because their own supply system failed them. November 1942 at Gona. Australian troops overran a Japanese position near the coast. What they found inside that defensive position would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The Japanese soldiers there were too weak to retreat. Some couldn't even stand up. They looked like walking skeletons, their uniforms hanging off bodies that had lost almost all their fat and muscle. Their cheekbones stuck out sharp under papery skin. Their eyes sat deep in hollow sockets. Some of them were trying to eat grass. Others were chewing on tree bark, their mouths working slowly like cattle. The ground around the position was littered with empty snail shells and the bones of small animals they had managed to catch and eat raw. One Australian sergeant wrote in his diary that night. He said the Japanese soldiers looked like they belonged in photos from a famine, not on a battlefield. He described finding them trying to eat discarded Australian ration tins, licking the insides for any trace of food that might be left. These weren't men anymore, he wrote. They were ghosts who just hadn't finished dying yet. Medical officers who examined captured Japanese soldiers found they weighed between 40 and 45 kilograms. A healthy Japanese man of that era typically weighed 60 kilograms or more. These soldiers had lost a third of their body weight. Their hearts were struggling. Their immune systems had collapsed. Many of them died even after receiving medical care, because their bodies were too damaged to recover. The reversal was complete and devastating. In July, Japanese officers had laughed at Australian rations. By November, Japanese troops were risking their lives to attack Australian supply lines, not for ammunition or weapons, but for food. They would bypass Australian fighting positions to get to supply dumps. They would wait in ambush near drop zones where aircraft delivered rations. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that Japanese soldiers talked about Australian food constantly. It became an obsession that overshadowed everything else. Some units broke formation and discipline entirely, with small groups of men deserting to search for food on their own. By January 1943, the Australian system had scaled up dramatically. 120,000 Australian troops were receiving jungle rations. The production facilities back home were churning out 3,600 tons of specialized ration components every month. 42 ships were dedicated solely to transporting these rations across the Pacific. The logistics operation had become as large and complex as the combat operations it supported. Supply officers joked grimly that they were running a grocery delivery service to hell, but the joke had truth in it. Without that constant flow of food, the entire military operation would collapse within weeks. The Japanese tried to fix their supply problems, but every solution failed. Their naval losses meant that 73% of their supply ships were being sunk by late 1943. Submarines and aircraft picked them off one by one. The few ships that got through couldn't carry enough to feed all the troops scattered across the Pacific Islands. Japan's industrial capacity was focused on building weapons, not developing specialized rations. And perhaps most damaging of all, Japanese military doctrine refused to officially admit that starvation was even a problem. To admit it would be to admit weakness. So soldiers continued to die while officers wrote reports that blamed everything except the supply system. Other Allied forces watched and learned. American troops in the Pacific were eating better than the Japanese, but they still had 15% more disease than Australian forces using the jungle rations. British forces in Burma faced catastrophic starvation problems in their early campaigns. It wasn't until late 1943, when they adopted a system based on the Australian model, that their situation improved. The evidence was overwhelming. Proper nutrition wasn't a luxury. It was the foundation that everything else rested on. A Japanese prisoner of war captured in December 1942 kept a diary that Australian intelligence officers found and translated. One entry stood out. He had written that the enemy eats like lords while we die like dogs, and asked how his side could possibly win under those conditions. It was a question that cut to the heart of everything. An Australian soldier wrote a letter home around the same time that showed the surreal nature of jungle warfare. He told his family that he and his friend Jerry had eaten tinned peaches and cream for dessert that night, in a jungle, during a war. He wrote that the whole thing felt mad, like they were camping instead of fighting. The psychological impact of food went beyond just keeping bodies alive. Australian officers began using it as a weapon in itself. They would deliberately leave ration tins near Japanese positions where enemy soldiers could see them. Imagine being a starving man, watching your friends die of hunger, and then finding evidence that your enemy is eating fruit and cream just a few hundred meters away. It destroyed morale more effectively than any propaganda leaflet could. Japanese soldiers started surrendering, something that had been almost unheard of in the early years of the war. In the first year of fighting, only 12 Japanese soldiers had surrendered to Australian forces. By the war's end, that number had climbed to 547. Many of them said they surrendered because they were starving and knew the Australians would feed them. The scale of the Australian ration program kept growing. Between 1942 and 1945, factories produced 47,000 tons of jungle rations. Over 400,000 Allied troops eventually used either Australian rations or modified versions based on the Australian design. The cost was £12 million, which seemed enormous at the time. But military analysts later calculated that the ration program saved approximately 15,000 lives. Put another way, every pound spent on food saved more than one life. No weapon system could claim that kind of return on investment. The most effective way to kill enemy soldiers, it turned out, was to make sure your own soldiers stayed alive and strong enough to fight. When the war ended in 1945, the Australian jungle ration didn't disappear. Instead, it became the template that other armies studied and copied. American military planners took the Australian design and modified it for their own needs. The basic principles stayed the same: high calories, nutritional balance, compact packaging, food that could survive extreme conditions and didn't need complicated preparation. British forces, who had initially dismissed the Australian approach as wasteful, completely changed their doctrine. For the first time in the long history of the British military, nutrition became a formal priority with its own manuals, training programs, and dedicated officers. The change didn't happen because of some great philosophical shift. It happened because the numbers were undeniable. Armies that fed their soldiers properly won. Armies that didn't lost. The influence kept spreading through the decades. Modern MREs, the meals ready to eat that soldiers carry today, trace their ancestry directly back to those Australian jungle rations from 1942. The idea that you could pack a complete balanced meal into a lightweight package that would last for years. The understanding that soldiers needed more than just calories, they needed variety to maintain morale. The recognition that food was part of the weapons system, not separate from it. All of these concepts started with people like Lieutenant Colonel Lydon doing basic math and refusing to accept that soldiers had to starve. Military training changed too. Before World War II, logistics was often treated as boring support work, something that couldn't compare to the glory of combat. After the war, military academies around the world started teaching that logistics could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. Officers learned to calculate caloric requirements for different types of operations. They learned that a soldier doing heavy labor in cold weather needed different nutrition than a soldier in tropical heat. They learned that supply lines were just as important as battle lines, maybe more important. A general with brilliant tactics but poor logistics would lose to a general with average tactics but excellent logistics. History had proven it over and over. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Leyden never became famous. Most Australians today have never heard his name. He received the Order of the British Empire, which was a respectable honor, but not the kind of recognition that comes with monuments and history books. There are no statues of Leyden, no schools or streets named after him. The Australian Army Service Corps, the unit he served with, was eventually absorbed into the modern Logistics Corps during military reorganization. In 1968, a military historian tracked down Leyden and interviewed him about the jungle ration program. Leyden was an old man by then, retired and living quietly. When asked about his contribution to the war, he said something that captured his whole approach perfectly. He said they just did the math. Soldiers need fuel like engines need petrol. It was that simple to him. Figure out what the human body needs, then provide it. No mystery, no magic, just basic problem solving. But Leyden's humility hid the real significance of what he and others like him had accomplished. They had challenged centuries of military tradition, the idea that soldiers were supposed to suffer, that hardship built character, that complaining about food was a sign of weakness. These beliefs were so deeply embedded in military culture that they seemed like natural laws. Leyden and his colleagues had proven those beliefs were not just wrong, but deadly. They had shown that taking care of soldiers wasn't coddling them. It was enabling them to do their jobs. A well-fed soldier could march farther, fight harder, think clearer, and survive longer than a starving one. This should have been obvious, but somehow it took a world war to make people accept it. The lessons about logistics and supply chains reached far beyond military applications. After the war, the same principles started showing up in business, disaster relief, and humanitarian work. Organizations learned that you couldn't just focus on the frontline action while ignoring the support systems that made that action possible. Modern military budgets reflect this understanding. Today, about 70% of military spending goes to support and logistics rather than direct combat. That ratio would have shocked generals from earlier eras, but it reflects reality. Wars are won by the side that can keep its forces supplied, maintained, and ready to fight month after month. Recent conflicts have proven these lessons over and over. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the biggest surprises was how quickly Russian logistics collapsed. Their troops ran out of food and fuel within days. Soldiers were seen on camera trading ammunition for civilian food. Units abandoned vehicles because they had no fuel. The whole invasion stalled not because Ukrainian forces were so strong, but because Russian supply lines were so weak. Military analysts watching the conflict immediately recognized the pattern. It was the same pattern that had destroyed the Japanese in the Pacific. An army that can't feed itself can't fight, no matter how many soldiers or tanks it has. The ghost of the Kokoda track haunted the roads of Ukraine, teaching the same lesson to a new generation. The Japanese officers who smirked at those Australian ration crates in July 1942 had witnessed their own men dying of hunger for months before that moment. They had seen soldiers collapse on the trail. They had watched disease tear through their units. They had read reports about the lack of food, but they assumed all soldiers suffered equally. That hardship was simply the price of war that everyone paid. What they couldn't understand, what their training and culture wouldn't let them see, was that their enemy had refused to accept that assumption. The Australians had done something revolutionary by treating the problem of keeping soldiers fed not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a weapon system that deserved the same careful engineering as a tank or an aircraft. In the end, the most important question wasn't about who had the superior soldier. Japanese troops were brave, disciplined, and tough. Australian troops were brave, disciplined, and tough. The difference wasn't in the quality of the men. The difference was in who refused to let their soldiers starve. Victory didn't come from superior courage or better tactics, though those things mattered. Victory came from butter and jam and chocolate and someone who had done the math and convinced others that feeding an army properly wasn't weakness. It was warfare. The next time you see a soldier's ration pack, whether in a museum or in a documentary or being carried by troops today, remember the story behind it. Remember that someone had to fight bureaucracy and budget constraints and centuries of military tradition to prove that keeping soldiers fed was worth the cost. Remember the Japanese soldiers who died eating grass because their leaders believed suffering built character. Remember the Australian soldiers who stayed strong enough to win because their leaders believed math was more important than tradition. And remember that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with guns at all. Sometimes they're fought with spreadsheets and supply chains and the simple human decency to acknowledge that soldiers are people who need food to survive.